From the Council and from the Commission on the conclusions of the European Council 29th of April 2017. I give the floor to President Tusk.
Grazie, Presidente. President Tajani, members of the European Parliament, I would like to report the outcome of the first formal meeting of the European Council of 27, which took place on the 29th of April. Our main purpose was to adopt political guidelines for the Brexit negotiations, a mandate that sets out the overall principles, objectives and process, and a mandate that the European Council will update as necessary as the talks get underway. A key element of the guidelines is the need to conduct the talks on the basis of a phased approach. This means simply that there will be no discussion of the framework for our future relations with Britain before sufficient progress is made on ensuring an orderly withdrawal. Leaders fully supported this logic. To ensure an orderly withdrawal, we first and foremost need to address the situation of more than 4 million people whose lives will be directly impacted by Brexit, on both sides. In a very real way, their futures depend on the outcome of these talks. It is our particular responsibility to secure the best guarantees for citizens of the Union and for their families. That means guarantees that are effective, enforceable, non-discriminatory and comprehensive, accompanied by simple and smooth administrative procedures. There is a need to act quickly, and so we are ready. Now we must move from sharing objectives to actually ensuring that citizens get the necessary guarantees. That's also why I welcome the fact that the Commission has already listed a number of detailed requirements. The second priority in the first phase is the need to agree that all financial commitments undertaken by the EU of 28 will also be honoured by the UK. And thirdly, in order to protect the peace and reconciliation process described by the Good Friday Agreement, we must aim to avoid a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Only once there is sufficient progress on these priorities can we proceed to the next phase of the negotiations about our future relations. And it will be for the European Council of 27 to assess and decide if and when we have achieved sufficient progress. When it comes to our future, the European Council shared the United Kingdom's desire to establish a close partnership. It is obvious, however, that a relationship between the European Union and a non-member state cannot offer the same benefits as EU membership. It is clear that a free trade agreement between the EU and the UK, which is what the UK has chosen, even if it is ambitious and wide-ranging, cannot mean participation in the single market or its parts. And at the same time, the UK must be aware that any free trade agreement will have to ensure a level playing field and encompass safeguards against unfair competitive advantages through, inter alia, tax, social, environmental and regulatory measures and practices. Today it is too early to tell much more about our common future, but we will make our guidelines more precise when the time comes, namely when sufficient progress in the first phase is achieved. Leaders responded with the urgency that the situation requires. there will be very little time to conclude withdrawal talks within the framework foreseen by the treaty. Time is of the essence here, and much is at stake. Next Monday, the Council will adopt a set of negotiating directives proposed by the chief negotiator on the basis of the guidelines we adopted on April 29th. These cover the three issues I have just mentioned, plus a number of other matters that need to be addressed in the first phase of the negotiations. Since the referendum in June last year, we, the EU 27, have been united, consistent, and demonstrated solidarity with one another. What was and remains most important for me is that our conduct in these talks will show the European Union at its best in terms of unity, political solidarity, and fairness towards the United Kingdom. Finally, I can only praise the European Parliament and its leaders for the role they have played. Sincere thanks and appreciation for your constructive assistance. This bodes well, not only for the future of the negotiations, but our future as a union of 27. Thank you.
Maintenant, je donne la parole à Jean-Claude Juncker, président de la Commission.
Now I give the floor to Jean-Claude Juncker, President of the European Commission.
President of the European Council, colleagues.
This House, I will speak in all three of our important working languages. I will start in English by congratulating President Tusk on last month's European Council. I have attended more summits than I care to remember, and never have I seen agreement reached so quickly. I can assure you this does not happen by accident. It is in fact testimony to the work of all Member States and all EU institutions, the work they have done together since last June. Michel Barnier and his team have been up and running across Europe to make sure every voice is heard. I would like to pay tribute to him. I want to wish him luck for the negotiations, as I know he will leave nothing to chance. This is exactly the same approach that President Tusk and I have always taken. The Council conclusions from April and the draft negotiation mandate proposed by the Commission earlier this month are speaking for themselves. I am confident that the draft mandate will be adopted by the Council next Monday, May 22nd. The process shows how united and prepared the European Union will be. It underlines how deep our commitment to transparency already is. This is why I see no need for me this morning to go into any more detail about the negotiations. Michel will do it later on this morning. This negotiation is now in the hands of our capable divorce lawyers. Monsieur le Président, Mesdames, Messieurs.
President, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to underline that in the sidelines of this European Council, we concluded three important agreements that confirm that it's often in the sidelines that the best work gets done. The first agreement between Denmark and Europol is particularly important for citizens' security because it will allow a sufficient level of cooperation to be pursued, particularly on the exchange of operational data. The second agreement is on Portugal and Spain about temporary deposit of nuclear waste in Almaraz, and thirdly, the agreement with Slovenia and Croatia to find operational solutions on the ground to better have territorial management and cooperation of the Schengen rules in the two countries. In each of these negotiations, the Commission put out a bridge between differing positions, pursuing negotiations right until agreements were achieved, and without the Commission these agreements wouldn't have seen the light of the day. People often say the Commission should just deal with its own house and not interfere in others' problems. However, if the Commission doesn't deal with other people's problems, those problems remain. So these three agreements, I think, speak much louder than fine words. Europe is this constant effort to build bridges to try to find agreements or come up with compromises. That is the Commission's mission, which it will continue to pursue. I would like to warmly thank the Parliament for the constant support that you lend us in our mission. President, ladies and gentlemen, this unity which we've been able to demonstrate in the Council will be our guiding principle during the Brexit negotiations. This is in the interest of citizens, and it's also in your interest that we don't consider exclusively on the Brexit issue, but on a broader programme. We're going to do that with the help of the Parliament. In the first half of the Commission's mandate, we, the Commission, together with your Parliament, achieved a great deal, also because we were always able to sing from the same hymn sheet. We didn't only implement the investment plan very quickly, to the tune of 183 billion in 28 member states. We've mobilised that amount of money. That's a success story. We've also set up the European Border Coast Guard, which can help better protect our borders. Together with the trade agreement with Canada, we've taken a major step forward. This agreement secures jobs and makes it very clear that European standards and rules have to be applied at international level. And these are three examples just to remind you that we can do a great deal with pooled forces. So this unity is key in our thinking and in our action, and that will continue to be our motto in the second half of the Commission's mandate. For example, in connection with setting up a true single digital market, we have tabled 35 proposals. Some still need to be fine-tuned. We need the active cooperation of the Parliament to this end. In the second half of our mandate, which is also the second half of your legislature, we need to use this time to deliver so that people can really feel that Europe is contributing something, and that's going to be tested at the next European elections. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. And good morning to Mr. Barnier, the Chief Brexit Negotiator, in Italian. Let's now have the group spokesman, and first of all, Manfred Weber on behalf of the European People's Party.
President in Office, President of the Commission, my congratulations to you on taking such a rapid decision. My congratulations to you on reaching such a rapid decision. I congratulate, of course, first and foremost, Donald Tusk, but equally Monsieur Barnier, who has been entrusted with the task of being chief negotiator by Mr. Juncker, and he is doing an excellent job of preparation. We are determined to remain united, we are resolute, and I think that we can be very proud of what the EU27 has done hitherto. We have been very clear as to the methodology we envisage. We feel, first of all, we need to discuss withdrawal. We will then move on to discuss the future partnership. We've consistently said we're against cherry picking. We've consistently said that a third state cannot enjoy the same status as a member country. And we have a very clear expectation, which is that the expectations of the people of Europe have got to be met, which means that we have to take into account the interests of the 78% of the people of Europe who have expressed this view. And therefore the EPP is resolute in supporting these basic principles. We also endorse a number of further principles, such as, for example, keeping families together. We are aware, having been in Ireland last year, that there are families affected by the border situation in Ireland, and we want to be quite clear to the Irish that we are behind them, that we understand the need for solidarity, that we support them in giving them the certainty and assurance that they can be together and supported as a family. We look also, of course, in the context of the Brexit negotiations to the situation in Europe. Might I remind you that at the beginning of the year in Koblenz, we saw the right, the anti-Europeans, the alt-right saying that this was going to be the end of the world, the birth of a new world, the birth of an entirely new setup. She is not here today. Many of her supporters are not here today either, but I would like to say that we should cast our thoughts back and think what we were told would happen and see what is actually happening now in 2017. Mr. Farage, for example, is now defending a party which is politically dead in the UK. It is without leadership. Indeed, it could even be said that he is not standing for Parliament and that this is a cowardly decision. It is clear that his policy has led to constructing of borders. This is the threat which hangs over Northern Ireland and Ireland very clearly. And it is also clear that whatever discussions took place with Donald Trump, he has certainly discussed many things. Even if Donald Trump has now got so much more to do, he possibly doesn't have time for many telephone conversations at the moment. But it is very clear that this line, which has been espoused by Nigel Farage and his followers, is going to bring huge danger and indeed disaster for much of his country. If we cast our eyes back to Koblenz again, there were expectations that Wilders would win the election and that the rise of the AfD and neo-Nazis in Germany would pose a huge problem for the Europe of the future. In France, the possibility was clear that the victory of Marine Le Pen was a clear possibility on the cards. So we were told once again. She denied the need for respect of constitutional law. She's now supposed to be brought before the judiciary in France. She can't even raise enthusiasm from her own political family in France. And over half the French population is clearly prepared to state that they are afraid of her policies. This is what remains of the populism which was rearing its ugly head last year. But now, look, it has failed. It has been defeated. And this gives us an opportunity for a fresh start to revitalise Europe. This is a very good balance sheet for the first half of 2017. We have achieved successes. We have a recently elected new French president. We can see that the new partnership between the new leader of France and the German chancellorship is an excellent one. We can see that the engine room of the European Union is functioning strongly. We can see that we have good priorities, sound priorities for the future of Europe. And finally, I'd like to say, colleagues, that we are now seeing a fresh impetus. The winds of change are blowing through Europe, and we need to capitalise on this. We need to make sure that we make the absolute most of it throughout our European Union. We need to capitalise on the opportunities we have. Look at what's happening in America, questioning of the Paris Climate Agreement. We have set the agenda. We've been leaders in climate change. We've been the vanguard of this movement. And thanks to the work of the Commission, we've achieved higher growth rates than the Americans have in this European Union. So, colleagues, right throughout Europe, we have achieved much. We've got proper medical insurance, and people who are ill have access to health. Whilst in America, they're destroying Obamacare, and millions of people can't afford health insurance in the first place. So we have tested and tried proven achievements here. We have shown that you can deal with nuclear issues through diplomacy. And I think we have also shown that we can overcome crises, and we need to speak loudly and clearly about the huge successes that we've achieved. Thank you.
La parola.
Our next speaker, on behalf of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, is Mr. Gualtieri.
Presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. The speedy adoption of the negotiation guidelines for the withdrawal of the UK is a good signal, a sign of unity, which we contributed to with our resolution, helping in the drafting of the final text. Who would have thought, or those who would have thought, that we would be split, got it wrong. We now have a clear, balanced, fair line as far as Brexit is concerned in the European Union, and an excellent negotiator whom we fully back. We want a fair agreement which protects the interests of citizens, which respects the rights and duties which derive from our treaties and which will allow us to have the UK as our close partner in the future, although of course it'll never have the same benefits as a full member state would have. For this to be achieved, we need to use to the full the limited amount of time available, and the timetable for the negotiations in the guidelines is vitally important. We need to make certain we have an orderly withdrawal for the UK and that it be marked by key progress on the most important issues. We obviously don't want anything to happen to imperil the peace process in Northern Ireland. So we're very pleased with the guidelines of the proposal for a directive, and we need to protect all citizens of the UK, no matter where they live and work, whether it's the UK or the Union. We're talking about a series of interconnected issues: social security, the freedom of movement of workers, recognition of professional qualifications, rights which need to be guaranteed forever, full reciprocity, no discrimination, and the whole thing under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Our Parliament is aware that discussions with the UK can't lead to an agreement if those conditions aren't met, and we're confident that no matter what government the UK has after the elections, we will see constructive negotiations which will begin soon, so as to give confidence and proper environment for companies in the UK and the European Union. Parliament and our group are willing and ready to contribute to this in a positive way, and we need to snatch the opportunity that we have to breathe new life into the European Union. We are proud of the European Union, but we don't want to leave it at that. We want the Commission and the Member States to be bold. We want them to make significant progress along the road which this Parliament has traced out: more investment, more reform, more solidarity, more democracy. We are ready to go on that adventure, and everyone needs to come with us. Thank you. On behalf of the European Conservatives and Reformists, I give the floor to Raffaele Fitto.
Grazie.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, sometimes, particularly in politics, words have their weight, and those that we've heard in the last weeks, if had been followed by facts, would have been a huge blow in terms of relations between the UK and the EU. Now, Brexit negotiations can't be about revenge or punishment to the UK and its citizens who are preparing to leave the EU but not abandon Europe. Whatever the opinions are in this chamber, there's one thing that we have to be very clear and unified on. It's in the interest of both parties to arrive at a fair agreement that's to everyone's benefit. Our citizens have to be our priority. We need to find an agreement as soon as possible on their rights, to then look at the fundamental issues such as the trade agreements, because there's not only regulations in terms of a relationship between the EU and a third country that's at stake, but far more. What's at stake has direct impact on jobs, lives, families, people's security in a time marked by various ongoing terrorist threats. We have to keep that in mind. It won't be a Brexit steered by rage on both sides. Brexit is not about punishment, but it should be based on creating a relationship with the UK which allows us to review the way that the EU works, and which allows us to understand why British people felt that they'd be better off outside the EU than within it. And despite the results of the elections, based on what I've heard this morning, which might have made many of us here breathe a sigh of relief, I think we should ask ourselves why millions of British citizens, Dutch and French citizens as well, not only, but others as well, have felt that it was important to vote in such an anti-European way. I think that's the question we have to ask ourselves here. It's time to look ourselves in the mirror. Now, it's not enough simply to continue business as usual, but people want change and they want specific responses. So basically now it's about taking this opportunity of negotiations between London and Brussels to actually reflect about ourselves, discuss about ourselves and about where the EU is going. We in the ECR for a long time have been stating that it's necessary to review the treaties, to come up with new rules of the game, to make the Union more open and flexible. And now we're seeing that Macron, the French president, and the German Chancellor Merkel want to change the treaties. But that isn't enough. We need to say in which direction the treaties need to be changed. If the direction is less Europe, more flexibility, more tax competition, more respect for national parliaments, then I think that's the right approach. If, however, the direction, once again, is, as we fear, that there's more Europe, more rigidity, more tax harmonization and more imposed from top down from Brussels, that would be imperiling our future. So let's stop thinking about rejection and self-preservation. Instead, let's see how we can really change. How can we get out of Brexit strengthened and renew confidence in the future of our citizens? This is the commitment that we in the ECR are taking. Thank you. On behalf of the ALDE group, and I give the floor to Mr. Verhofstadt.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I think on Brexit everything has been said. We have a mandate, there is a unity of the position of the European Union, of the 27, of the 3 institutions. I think also everything is going well with the negotiation directives that will be approved on Monday. So I think there is only one thing to do now, Michel, is to start the negotiations. And to start them the fastest as possible. We have to wait for the outcome of the British election. Okay, but after the 8th of June, let's start. But I want to talk about something that is related to Brexit. And that is the future of the European Union and the reform of the European Union, because it should be a mistake to put all our energy only in Brexit in the coming years. At least the same energy, if not more energy, we have to put in the reform, in the future of the European Union. 3 times in a row now, the nationalists and the populists have been beaten in Austria, in the Netherlands and in France. And I think that it didn't happen by accident. I think that Brexit played an important role in this. People all over Europe have been, in fact, let me say that, shocked by the decision of Great Britain to leave the European Union. And this, don't misunderstand me, people are today very critical towards the European Union, and for good reason. But what they don't want to do is what Britain did, to leave the European Union. And it's very clear. The Austrians didn't want an exit, the Dutch didn't want an exit, and the French didn't want a Frexit. They say, reform the European Union, yes. Leave the European Union, no bloody way. That is the message of the people of the European Union today. But we cannot make one mistake, and that is to think now, oh, it's over. Populism and nationalism have been defeated. And I heard this reaction all too often in the European circles. A little bit, yeah, Macron won, Le Pen lost, relief, let's go to the normal agenda and let's do business as usual. Well, I think that one mistake that we cannot make, that is to think that people voted for Macron for change and not for the status quo, not for a standstill. They voted for a radical change in France, but also in Europe. And so the best thing to do is in fact to back his reformist agenda, a reformist agenda that we all know now, a reformist agenda with a new Euro budget, with a Minister of Finance for Europe, with a Euro Treasury, with Euro investment bonds, with the transnational list that he is proposing. And I have to tell you, Manfred, I was relieved to hear on Monday the reaction in Berlin, the positive reaction in Berlin. A reaction a little bit different from the 999 of Mr. Schäuble and of a lot of German press since the arrival of Mr. Macron. I like more Merkel's "Wir schaffen das," like she repeated in the press conference with Macron than the 999 of Mr. Schäuble before. So I think it's really time now to use this Brexit negotiation for a new vision, Mr. Tusk, and for a new future for Europe. In fact, a future that our young people want. Look to what is happening, Pulse for Europe, in more than 100 cities. Overall in Europe, in the squares, young people are coming together asking for more and a democratic European Union. How do you call this? I call this audacity. And that brings me to paraphrase Danton in this. De l'audace, encore de l'audace. Toujours de l'audace.
Boldness, boldness and more boldness, and we can save Europe.
On behalf of the GUI NGL, I give the floor to Mrs. Zimmer.
Thank you very much indeed, President. I would be delighted to be able to share this hope and conviction and optimism about the saving of the European Union. I absolutely endorse the principles, but the actual approach as to how we achieve it is something which I may need to beg to differ. It is very true that we need to draw consequences from the Brexit vote. The citizens voted. We need to commit ourselves to what sort of European Union we want. As a result of this, we can't just leave the shaping of the European Union up to the governments. We need to shape the European Union ourselves for our citizens, and this is what is at stake, and this is what we must fight for. And this is why the negotiations on Brexit have got to be used inter alia for us to make resoundingly clear that we can't have a simplistic solution. It would be all too easy to say that we've vanquished populism through the votes in France and the Netherlands, and therefore it's business as usual. But this cannot possibly be justified. We've got to recognise that there are still too many people who will support authoritarian populism, and therefore we have to counter this. And we need a strong counter-narrative which shows that the European Union has a value of its own in and of and for itself. And this is why we need to show that if we aspire to protect the European Union ad aeternum, then we've got to renew, constantly renew, that we need a Europe which meets the expectations, aspirations and demands of our citizens. And if we don't renew in this way, then we will fail. However positive our approach is, we will fail unless we take into account the expectations and wishes of the people, such as the trade unions, such as the citizens of Europe who've spoken out in favour of social policy, a social pillar of Europe. We need to build this for them, and we need to build on the initial steps that have been taken. We need to look at the implications of freedom of movement. It's a perfectly valid principle in theory, but it has to work for the citizens in Europe, as does the Posting of Workers Directive have to work for the citizens of Europe. And we can't have a system which only works for some citizens, and a situation where many citizens actually can't even endorse the basic principles of the European Union anymore. We need a social Europe. We need one which transcends our frontiers, and then we can have a proper European social policy, a social pillar which will speak to our citizens. And this is what we should be prioritising now. We've seen only some initial steps towards this, and we haven't gone anything like far enough yet. And there are still far too many counter movements coming from the European member states. For example, in the CSU that isn't in favour of paternity rights or certain provision for older workers. This is a problem. We have actually got to have the courage of our convictions and address these very fundamental principles. We've been aware of the fact that there were problems even before Brexit. We've been aware of the fact that, for example, young people have aspirations and we're not delivering on them, that there are problems with, for example, being allowed to draw benefits in other countries, with child benefit and all kinds of other welfare provisions. So we've got to resolve some of these difficulties and make sure that the system works for the people rather than against them. And this is what I say to you, Mr. Fitto, because this is a completely different approach to the future of the EU from what you're recommending. Thank you.
On behalf of the Greens, I give the floor to Mr. Lambert.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, I'm pleased that Parliament and Council have managed to agree to a large extent on a negotiating mandate with the UK, which is not revenge-based and is not naive. There is, of course, a series of problems which would be caused by Brexit and a series of priorities we need to address. Are we going to learn the lessons from Brexit? I hope that's the case. We avoided the worst in the Netherlands, Austria and France. Populist national forces, though, are reaching considerable numbers of the people and are gaining electoral success. And abstentions and spoiled ballots show the extent to which citizens have found their confidence in Europe and its institutions shaken. This feeling of loss of identity, fear that they will lose what they've got. The recent success of the National Front shows that globalisation and particular technological advances are a major cause of the loss of income and the unfair or even illegal distribution of wealth. Even if you look at what happens in Davos, in the WTO, even the European Commission, our economic system is basically forgetting about a large number of the citizens. But changes in technology and globalization need to work for everyone. So we need to do that to train people, make them employable. And also we need to activate workers who are out of a job. Alleviate the pressure, therefore, which forces people towards those parties which live on fear. So people feel that this can't be stopped, that machines will replace human beings, but each robot, MIT has told us, that's installed gets rid of 7 jobs. There's more and more casualisation of labour. Surely we need to rethink the way work is organised completely, as well as our financial system. Let's have a robust social protection which works for everybody and not just shareholders. We can't keep levelling down, even if that's what companies want. Globalisation should level up. It should improve social, environmental and democratic standards. If those things happen, we'll be able to show that we've learned the lessons of Brexit. We will be able to show that we're not interested in containing this wave, but we are rolling it back. That's the way our citizens will get the trust and confidence back in Europe, if they feel that their interests are being protected by us. We will be able, therefore, to integrate more in the European Union. That's the only way for us to get control of our own destiny again. Thank you.
On behalf of the EFDD, I give the floor to Mr. Farage.
Thank you. Imagine you invited a very important guest round for dinner, and you made all the preparations, and there were some very important confidential conversations that needed to be had, and you thought everything had gone well, and yet within hours your guest had told the outside world that you, the host, were deluded, that you were living in a different galaxy. And then all the contents of the conversation were blabbed to an opposition newspaper, and to add insult to injury, you say the food wasn't actually very good either. And then a few days later, in a display of extreme petulance, you even deride the national language of the host, which, by the way, is looking a bit silly, because last Saturday's extravaganza, known as the Eurovision Song Contest, saw 90% of the songs sung in English. Now, if you were the host and you'd been treated like that by somebody that you thought was important and somebody you thought you could trust, I think you'd be asking yourself, were you dealing with a reasonable person? Now, I don't know, Mr. Juncker, whether this is how you carry on in Luxembourg. I doubt it. because in any other part of the civilised world, frankly, that behaviour would be considered to be bloody rude and the act of a bully. Well, I'll tell you something. Your attempt to bully the Brits through this negotiation is not working. 68% now of the British people want Brexit to happen. And all of that on top of a ludicrous ransom that Monsieur Barnier wants, that I'm told has now doubled to €100 billion. Either we get some grown-up, reasonable demands from the European Union, or the United Kingdom will be forced to walk away before the end of this year. We can't spend 2 years with this farce. There is a big, big world out there, and I'm beginning to think that perhaps, I very rarely agree with Marxists, but perhaps Mr Varoufakis is right when he says about negotiating with the EU, it is a technocracy that is desperately clinging on to its own exorbitant and illegitimate power. You may have crushed Greek democracy 2 years ago. You ain't going to do it to us.
Mr.
de Graaf for the ENF.
Voorzitter, de buitengewone...
President, the Special Council, which met at the end of April, confirmed that European integration has brought peace and prosperity to Europe. I wonder how many times the elite is going to continue to peddle this myth, because prosperity and welfare are hardly what we have seen recently. There is unprecedented unemployment and there is no prospect of improvement for all too many people. Our frontier to the east is close to war because of what's going on in the Ukraine, and there is a dictator further east who is at large. There is also a Brexit vote which has meant that the European Union will no longer be an EU of 28. I would rather see the EU dismantle itself completely. What have we achieved? We've got mass immigration, we've got closed frontiers, we've got closed borders. We want to see action taken. We want action against NGOs that are simply supporting human traffickers. We want action on the Libyan coast, and I'd say to you, Mr. Libya, close the borders, to Mr. Juncker, close the borders and take some action and resign.
La parola.
Now give the floor to Mr. Woolfe.
Thank you, Mr. President. We now know how the EU 27 leaders plan to negotiate with Brexit. On first glance, it appears reasonable. But like everything the EU says, on closer inspection, you can see the malevolent intent of an EU that tempers no opposition to its control. Like a playground bully, it says no member state can talk to the UK separately. Like an emperor, it grants Spain a veto over Gibraltar. And like a jilted spouse, it says the UK cannot go out and get a new trade partner until the divorce is finalised, or else. But for those of us in this chamber who want to bully us, threaten us, or demean us, may I remind you of the English poem by Rudyard Kipling about a Norman king warning his son about taking advantage of the English. The Saxon is not like us Normans. His manners are not so polite, but he never means anything serious till he talks about justice and right. When he stands like an ox in the furrow with his sullen eyes set on your own and says, "This ain't fair dealing. My son, leave the Saxon alone." So when a French president says Brexit is a crime, we will say, we will not be imprisoned by your rudeness. When a Maltese president says the UK deal must be an inferior deal, we will say no deal is better than a bad deal. And when a German president says that without the EU, Britain cannot have its voice heard in the world, we will say, listen to the sounds of a free Britain, an independent Britain, an outwardly looking Britain, trading, growing and expanding in the world, looking forward and not backwards. Thank you.
La parola.
Now give the floor to Mr. Royal.
Herr Präsident.
Mr. President, colleagues, the assessment of Brexit is very clear. It's got to be done in an orderly fashion and it's got to be effective. However, I do think the way that it's gone so far could be a model for now. Barnier and the troops have prepared thoroughly. The Parliament, the Council and the Commission have looked for common ground and found it. So it's been thoroughly prepared, it's been very specific, it's been pragmatic, and it's formulated based on common ground. And that way we'll be strong in negotiations. If only we could do that in other areas, people would have what they want. Now, they don't want a new dream or a new concept or any reforms. I don't believe that. They want results. They want successful European policies. They want to see that their concerns are being worked on by us as far as we can. Of course, we can't solve everything. Part of the responsibility lies with the Member States. However, the precondition for the EU is that it should help to find common solutions. And I think the response to Brexit and to what people are actually calling for and going onto the streets and saying that Europe is great, and that the answer to that to come up with new plans, new regulation, I think is completely missing the point. We actually need to deliver, and we need to demonstrate that European policy can help people's well-being in Europe and wealth. I think that's the path. And I think the start of the Brexit negotiations is an excellent contribution. It's very sober, it's pragmatic, it's not hyped. And even the Brits grumbling here, I think despite that we're showing that this is an excellent model for future cooperation. Now, you've interrupted me, but you've allowed others to speak longer. So let's have equal treatment for all. Yes, I'm sorry, sometimes you do have to limit speaking time. There's a blue card from Mr. Flanagan. Do you accept it?
Mr. Flanagan.
Thank you very much. We're often warned that maybe the translators have got it incorrect, but I do know that they get it correct when you use the word troops. If you did, I don't think it's an appropriate word when you talk about, as a German MEP, talking about negotiating with Britain about their freedom and sovereignty, to use the word troops, given the damage troops and wars have caused to this continent. So, were the translators correct? And if they were, please withdraw the word troops. We've had enough troops and enough war on this continent.
Merci, Mr. Flanagan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Flanagan. Well, if I actually said that, then I certainly didn't mean it like that, and I apologize. What I meant was that the the Member States and institutions have to work together. I didn't mean any more than that.
Merci, Madame Rodriguez.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Rodriguez. On behalf of the S&D Group. 1.5 minutes.
We have a clear, inconsistent line to deal with Brexit. So these are good news and create good conditions for our negotiators to start their work. Like that, we can also devote more energy to deal with our own future. And in both things, Brexit and our own future, the concern with citizens should be our central focus. So when it comes to the roadmap for the future of the European Union, the starting point to define the roadmap is to build up a convincing social pillar addressing the concerns of our peoples, but particularly young people, when they are dealing today with the so-called digital revolution and need to make sure they have a proper contract and full access to social protection. We need to build up welfare systems for the 21st century. And then we also need to address our citizens' concerns when we set new trade agreements in order to protect proper social and environmental standards. We need a new generation of these trade agreements. And again, we need to address citizens' concerns when managing migration and refugees crisis, because we know that the real solution for this is to address the root of the problem by supporting neighbourhood development and peace building. All of these must be translated into a community budget of the future. So our task is immense. And that's why we should work now with a real focus on a scenario which is not 1 or 2 or 5, should be a simple one. Let's work together for much better solutions on the relevant priorities.
Monsieur Fox, au nom du...
Mr. Fox, on behalf of the ECR Group, 1.5 minutes again.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. Today, I'll follow Mr. Juncker's example and speak in French in the hemicycle. The United Kingdom wants a fair, serious partnership with the European Union. We want an overall agreement dealing with economic relations as well as security matters. We want the European Union to behave well and do well after we leave. We want to protect the rights of European citizens who are currently residing in the United Kingdom, and we are convinced that our partners also want to protect the rights of British citizens living in Europe. As far as payments are concerned, we will of course meet our legal requirements. But you really shouldn't dream up these enormous figures simply to boost your coffers. We don't want controls at the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. Nevertheless, it's difficult to understand how it would work, since we don't even know what kind of trade relations we'll be having. The sooner we begin the negotiations on a free trade agreement, the more likely it is that they will be crowned with success.
Let us work together to build a new relationship that benefits all our citizens. Thank you.
Au nom du groupe ALDE, Madame Bearder.
Ms. Beard, on behalf of the Liberal Group.
Million European citizens are living their lives in constant frustration and a legal limbo. It's a state of anxiety for thousands of EU and UK citizens, with 7% reporting depression, some even suicidal. This is intolerable. The two parties in Brexit need quickly to agree to guarantee EU citizens' rights to reside. This is about treating people with dignity, allowing them to plan their lives, their learning and their loves. The British government must stop blaming and start acting governmental. No posturing, no calculating, the right out of the gate comprehensive agreement. All that is needed is one bold and generous political act, and British agencies must tear down the barriers they have erected, which are causing daily frustration and fear for so many people. Outside the convention of nothing is agreed till everything is agreed, we need a comprehensive right to reside agreement first, and we need that very, very quickly. Thank you.
Madame Anderson.
Ms. Anderson.
Thank you. The Council's guidelines on Brexit give support to the Good Friday Agreement in all of its parts, and that's crucially important. This is a commitment by the EU to not allow for any hardening of the border between the north and the south of Ireland. It is a commitment not to allow Irish and EU citizens like myself to be dragged out of the EU against our will. It is a recognition that the north of Ireland is not an internal matter for the United Kingdom, and a commitment that the people of the north will never again be left at the mercy of a ruthless and reactionary British government in London. Now that we have the guidelines, we should be putting some flesh on them regarding no hardening of the border in Ireland and fully upholding the Good Friday Agreement in all of its parts. There should be no weakening of this commitment in the negotiation directive that's to be adopted next Monday. Brexit is incompatible with the Good Friday Agreement. Brexit is the worst thing to have happened in Ireland since the last disaster in Ireland, which was the British partitioning of Ireland.
Madame Anderson, acceptez-vous?
Ms. Anderson, will you accept a blue card?
30 secondes.
Thank you, Madam, for taking my blue card. As someone who does not want to see a hard border but on both sides of the Northern Irish border, as you know, my family are Irish citizens, my wife's family, I understand much of the emotion that runs around this place, but surely we need to look back to the Common Travel Area agreements which was first made between Republic of Ireland, United Kingdom and indeed the other islands across the British Isles. And the first one was made just after the birth of the Irish Free State, so why can we not negotiate a new common travel area after Brexit and surely on a bilateral basis. We don't need to worry and concern so many people. The special relationship, I believe, is between Britain and the Republic of Ireland. Thank you.
Merci. Veuillez m'excuser, monsieur.
Can I say to you that the common travel area does not resolve the Brexit disaster that will happen in Ireland, and you should know that better than most. So be very clear. You talk about renegotiation. Tony Blair last week talked about renegotiating the Good Friday Agreement. That is a no-go area, and the common travel area does not solve the problem. You're deluding yourself if you think that's the solution. The only solution to the Brexit problem is that we have designated special status for the North within the EU or Irish unity.
Merci, madame.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Mr. Smith, 1 minute.
President, thank you. I'd pick up on Guy Verhofstadt's point about how Eurosceptics and populists have been beaten 3 times in recent elections. Well, but actually it's 4. In Scotland, we saw them off handsomely, with 62% of the vote in favour of remaining within our European family, and we remain in favour of remaining within our European family, and Scotland will not be silent, passive bystanders within this process. I'd also urge you that where the people of Scotland want to work with their friends and colleagues across the EU, there is a deliberate, willful agenda within UK politics to misrepresent and demonise this process and the personalities involved within it. We've heard it today. Don't give them more ammunition. Don't give them what they want. This is them getting their excuses in early. Brexit would have gone great except for those bloody foreigners. That is the narrative they're trying to kid on the British people with. Don't give them what they want. It's not in Scotland's name. And on the guidelines, Mr. President, I read them with a heavy heart, but I see little to dislike. But I would urge the suspension of the nothing is agreed till everything is agreed principle for citizens' rights. You could give real impetus to this by committing to an early agreement on this issue. We could make that work now for all of our citizens. Thank you.
Monsieur Paksas, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In the air, in this chamber, we there is the motive lingering about the most difficult conditions for the UK to exit the EU. We remember the times when Lithuania had expressed their willingness to become independent, and Lithuanians also wanted to exit the Soviet Union in an orderly fashion. There were so many things being discussed, the billions the Lithuanians owed to the Soviet Union, and the liabilities they had towards the Soviet Union. And we are very much surprised with the attitude of the European Council. What logics do we have to demand the UK to keep with all its international liabilities and commitments which they undertook when they became an EU member state?
Austritt Großbritanniens aus der Europäischen Union.
The withdrawal of Britain from the European Union is something that should be negotiated between adults, and yet too many people are behaving in a childish playground fashion, throwing stones in the direction of the UK and issuing threats. This is not the way to show political maturity. It's important to recognise the result of a referendum. Mr. Weber talked about patriotic parties. Some of what he said fits better with the Greens than with the EPP. But it is clear that in the Netherlands there was a big vote for Geert Wilders. In France, 34% of the people voted for Ms. Le Pen, and Mr. Weber's party didn't even have a candidate in the final round in the French elections because Mr. Fillon was excluded from the final race because of corruption suspicions. We cannot continue in this way.
Monsieur Papadakis, 1 minute aussi.
Mr. Papadakis, 1 minute.
Despite the expressions of optimism about the future of the European Union that we've heard this morning, the picture is not a good one. We are hearing about the ability of the EU to withstand international competition from China and indeed the United Kingdom when it leaves. The United Kingdom might leave before its bill is finally settled. That wouldn't work to the interest of the people of Europe. And either that means that it would serve the monopolies that run the European Union, and it wouldn't help the UK either. It's important that we see what happens with British capital after Brexit, and we make sure that the interests of the British people's interests aren't sacrificed on the altar of profit either. It's only through overthrowing capitalist power and freeing ourselves from the European Union and NATO that we can actually have a proper union which the interests of people will be served. Thank you.
Dziękuję. Wystarczył nam jeden dzień w Irlandii.
Thank you very much. We had but one day in the Irish Wicklow County to clearly see what the consequences would be of Brexit to a country which became a symbol of reconciliation and success following Ireland's joining of the EU. Ireland is a good case study of unintended costs of Brexit, but it is also but the tip of the iceberg. Each and every country has its own Brexit agenda. There are consequences from Gibraltar to Poland. For our country, what is important is the lives of Polish citizens residing in the UK, and they are now becoming victims of a mendacious Brexit campaign, Leave campaign. Now, I am happy that the EU27 have quickly found a negotiating platform, which is a good sign of unity when facing this huge challenge that Brexit is. Now, we are estimating our costs, but not only costs, like Mr. Weber and Mr. Verhofstadt said. Now, in 2017, we are looking towards the future with more optimism. There are fewer and fewer Brexit followers, and there are more and more people who understand the role and strength of Europe in the world. Thank you.
Monsieur Corbett pour 1 minute 30.
Mr. Corbett, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you. The European Council guidelines set out much more clearly than anything the British government has produced what the issues are in these negotiations. We still don't know, nearly a year after the referendum, what the British government hopes to achieve in terms of access to the single market and the customs union, in terms of how it intends to protect British farmers if they are no longer part of a common market with an agreed system of subsidies across Europe, what's going to happen to British fishermen. We don't know what is going to happen to British participation in the various technical agencies, the Aviation Agency, the Medicines Agency, chemicals and so on, whose certifications are a requirement for selling in the single European market. We only have silence from the British government. Yet there are nearly 1,000 issues, more than 1,000 issues, that need to be settled in this negotiation. We still don't know what the British government's intention is. Far from providing strong and stable leadership, Mrs. May is actually providing desperate and deluded leadership to the British people. Thank you.
Pour 1 minute, Monsieur Van Dalen.
Mr. Van Dalen, 1 minute. President, since the Brexit vote, we've seen on both sides of the channel that people's views are becoming more entrenched. People are taking up a position, and people you hope might have been reasonable are simply fueling the fire and fanning the flames. I'm thinking inter alia of Commission President Juncker. The reality of Brexit is going to be very tough for many individuals. It isn't just a question of the tug-of-war of negotiations. For years it's been a question of jobs and unemployment, but I'd like to give you an example of fisheries, which might be said to be a small sector, but could actually be one where the situation for coastal communities and many families is disastrous. 50% of the Dutch fishing is done in British waters. and access has to be guaranteed, for their livelihood to be guaranteed. The European Union should be there for the people. It's not a case of the people being there for the interests of the European Union. So let's all be constructive and try to come up with a rational and reasonable compromise. After 29, we all desperately need it, all of us. Thank you.
Flanagan, 1 minute.
Mr. Flanagan, 1 minute.
MEP Weber said that the winds of change are blowing through Europe. I don't disagree with him. Change is on the way. Mr. Fitto from the ECR mentioned change. Mr. Verhofstadt mentioned change. And apparently there's a process underway to decide what that change will be, called the White Paper on the Future of Europe. However, to know what the winds of change are and what direction they're going in, you must consult with the people. We were told last March we would be consulted with. We were told that there would be a series of Future of Europe debates to harvest and harness the opinions of the desired way forward. Last week I met Commissioner Hogan. He knew nothing about this process. Yesterday I asked Jean-Claude Juncker at the GUI NGL meeting, where is this process? Nobody can tell me. If the winds of change are coming, surely we should talk to the people. Perhaps Donald Tusk can tell me, where will these meetings take place? When will the consultation take place? Because if you're serious about it, you've got to talk to us. Have you any news? Because no one can tell me. Thank you.
Madame Atkinson, for 1 minute.
Well, everyone seems a bit embarrassed by Mr Juncker and his Chief of Staff, Mr Selmayr, including Donald Tusk, Mrs Merkel and Monsieur Barnier. You also think that we're being observed by other planets, you're quoted in the French press, because I can read French. You accuse Mrs May of living on another planet, but I think it's you, Mr Juncker, that is just living on your own Juncker planet. Sir, you're an embarrassment and you should step down. Mr Corbett praises the EU for their negotiating stance, but nobody's listening to his leader back at home. You're going to be annihilated in the polls. You're being run by a Marxist, so nobody's listening to you. Mrs Bearder, she sounds quite mad, completely and utterly mad, and her party is going to be wiped out in the next general election. But the good news is that 70% of the British public support Brexit now. We're a resilient...
Thank you, Madam.
We won the war for you in this place in World War II. We're not
Thank you, Madam. Could you come to a conclusion, please?
Reality will take place with the EU 27 and business, because it's business that actually does business in business.
Thank you, Madam. Could you conclude? Could you conclude, please?
Je suis désolée, Madame.
I'm sorry, Madam. You've overrun your speaking time. You need to conclude. You no longer have the microphone. Thank you.
Monsieur Lamassoure.
The next speaker is Mr. Lamassoure for a minute.
President.
Thank you, Madam President. There's no such thing as a happy divorce, but it might be less painful if the two sides behave with fair play. Theresa May's government, I think, understood this in Council. Their representative abstained on measures which were going to be applied after 2019. And bit by bit, though, they're putting vetoes onto issues which are crucially important for the Union and the Union alone. The revision of the MFF has been postponed, and recently the UK Minister opposed the creation of a general European headquarters. And this has been thought about for many years. It would be the first step towards a Europe of defence. Why would they want to weaken the Union when they're leaving it? Our joint interest is to have a strong European Union with the UK as a strong privileged partner. If this happens again, the 27 will have to learn to work together, not just when it comes to negotiating Brexit, but on all matters which will no longer be relevant for the United Kingdom. It's not a good thing for either side. Thanks very much, Madam President.
Mr. Gaillard, for 1 minute.
Mr. Gaillard, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. President, colleagues, isn't it astounding how offended some of the British colleagues, particularly on the right side of the House, claim to be, because they're saying that the EU politicians are attacking the UK and offending it. I don't think that's the case. I myself, and I think this applies to many colleagues, we're always completely shocked about how unprepared and irresponsible the British politicians and the Brexit camp are dealing with negotiations and not prepared to tell the truth to the British public. In other words, that you can't keep all the advantages of the EU and leave it at the same time. Now, it's very simple if you think about it. However, for the Brexit camp, it's still far too complex. And now the situation is such that the British government is taking the MFF commitments hostage because the 6 billion euros are now being called into question. I hope that the UK government will stick to its word and will allow this positive decision to go ahead after the elections and put this on the agenda. And I call upon the British government not to take the MFF negotiations hostage.
Mr. Nicholson, 1 minute.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam President. Can I first of all say I welcomed very much last week Mr Barnier's visit to the Republic of Ireland and his very clear message that how difficult this process is going to be. Because let us be under no illusion, solving the problem of the border, be it a hard border or a soft border, between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, is going to be massive. Be under no illusions about that. But I welcome the attempts and his clear spelling out of that problem. But I want to also make clear, politicians in Dublin nor Brussels do not speak for the people of Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland will speak for itself and they will decide for themselves. They are an integral part of the United Kingdom and they will decide where the future will be, and nobody else, and none of this process will do so other. So when I make that very clear, I do that with a degree of sincerity so as everyone understands where we stand. But I am extremely concerned at the way in which this process is going. I'm very concerned that we now have megaphone diplomacy across the English Channel, instead of cool heads sitting down, realistically looking at how we are going to solve these problems in the future between us. We want good relations between the United Kingdom and the rest of Europe, and I sincerely hope that both sides can realise that as this process goes forward and work to achieve that.
Madame Albiol Guzman pour 1 minute.
Ms. Albiol Guzman for 1 minute. Thank you very much indeed, President. It's not possible to talk about Brexit as if those who are in government were not responsible for it, because it's actually a direct result of the policies pursued by Mr Cameron, but also Ms Merkel and Mr Juncker and the grand coalition that's been governing Europe. Its austerity policies in the UK meant labour reform, university fees and more privatisation of the NHS. It's basically institutional racism, also depicting immigrants as responsible for all the woes of the country. The issue now is, of course, what will the impact of Brexit be on business, but for real people, for us, the implications are other, and we are concerned about guaranteeing the rights of Spaniards and many other nationals who are working in the UK, and also the people from the UK who are living and working in other EU countries. That's what we're concerned about, and about guaranteeing the rights of workers, cross-border workers, and people who are working in Gibraltar. Thank you.
Monsieur González Pons for 1 minute.
Mr González Pons, 1 minute.
On the 4th of December last year, Chairman, the extremists were defeated in Austria. In March it happened in the Netherlands, and it just happened in France. Doesn't matter where it happens, it's important that who we beat. We beat the people who think that people from other member states are foreigners, people who want to build walls and close borders. We beat the people who are campaigning on the basis of fear and hatred. The idea of a free Europe isn't a left-right thing. It's not social democracy or progressives or conservatives. What will free Europe is Europe against anti-Europe. There are going to be elections in Austria, Germany, and the Czech Republic. So let's learn these lessons. Let's change the Europe of the institutions for a Europe of well-being, security, the rule of law, legal migration, plurality of the media. Too often we've confused Europe with its institutions. It's not its institutions, it's much more. The time of institutional inertia is over, and Brexit put paid to that.
Mr. Niedermüller, 1 minute.
Köszönöm, elnök asszony. Mindannyian tudjuk, hogy a Brexit, a populizmus, a demagógia.
Thank you. We know that Brexit was a victory for populism and demagogues. And there are members here in the House who also contributed to misleading the citizens. They said that national interests were much more important than anything else. And Brexit has split society, but we need to overcome that, because if, as before, you look for enemies, you'll never be able to heal these wounds. After the 29th of April, I think we've got a clearer picture of what the negotiations will look like and how the two phases will pan out. I would like us to maintain close relations with the UK, also integrity of the single market and the fundamental freedoms that should be maintained. But in particular, what has to be clarified is the rights of EU citizens in the UK and conversely the UK citizens in the EU, because they've been working under a great deal of uncertainty now in terms of social rights, labour rights. These have to be granted on the basis of reciprocity. If that isn't possible, we won't be able to cooperate.
Sì, grazie.
Ms. Gardini for 1 minute. I would have liked to see the UK staying in the European Union, but the decision of the citizens is sovereign and must be respected. But we must remain close to them, because we need to stand together, the EU and the UK, to face the many challenges together, for economic challenges through to terrorism. Therefore, it is essential that we address, first of all, the rights of the 4 million people, as Mr. Tusk has said, the people who on both sides of the Channel will be first and most affected by Brexit. But we need to stand behind all our citizens going forward, and we therefore need to return to the origins of the European Union. We need to renew the pact that we made with our citizens, a pact for peace, for prosperity and for solidarity. Today, we see far too many big egos and egotism jostling for and jockeying for position. We need to be aware of the fact that we're living through a historic moment in time, and that the decisions which we take today will have a huge impact in the future. Therefore, we need all the courage we can muster up. Thank you. Ms. Sippel for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you. We're talking about Brexit, and we can remember that for years EU bashing was a favourite pastime in the UK. We were responsible for everything that went wrong, and now apparently the EU wants to punish the UK. Well, of course, we understand the concerns of a lot of people. Being able to travel, study, work everywhere in Europe is one of our major achievements, and now we're suddenly saying that won't be possible anymore because you're leaving. You're leaving the single market and therefore leaving the area of EU free movement, out of joint research programs, out of common fighting against crime and terrorism. Yes, of course you can cancel contract. However, the commitments are still ongoing. But this is not a punishment. Rather, we're just telling you the truth about what the consequences are of a decision that basically says we want out. We want out from the EU and therefore out of all areas. And that's why I would say to Theresa May, please finally put an end to these negative legends going round. Tell your citizens the truth, because it's only this way that we'll be able to have a proper fresh start for future relations between the EU and the UK. Thank you very much.
Mr. Brok, 1 minute.
Frau Präsidentin.
President of the Council, President of the Commission, Ladies and gentlemen, last week I was in Northern Ireland, I was in Belfast, and I had a number of discussions with people in civil society and others, and I have learnt from that week how perplexed people are and how worried and alarmed they are about the potential consequences of what is happening. And I pray that there will be some greater measure of realism in the minds of those in London in the wake of the election, and that they will realise that a hard Brexit would be a disaster for the people of Britain, in particular for Northern Ireland. It is absolutely essential that people are prepared to have constructive discussions and shoulder the responsibility which they surely should in terms of citizens' rights and budget contributions and the implications of the border in Ireland. We need a constructive agreement. We need realism above all in order to limit the damage for both parties and to avoid nationalist escalation of the rhetoric. We have heard and we have seen that Europe can actually win elections. For example, Emmanuel Macron is an example of that. You can win elections on a European platform, and this is why we have all got to serry our ranks and make the Macron operation a success to take Europe forward. Thank you. President, I'm going to open the Catch the Eye. I have a huge long list of people wishing to speak, so please stick to your speaking time, Mr. Polčák.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Of course, I agree with the fact that the utmost priority for the EU is Brexit. But there are also other challenges and other priorities that we need to face. We need to realize that terrorism has not gone away from our lives. It is still with us. And also, we need to stick to the 4 basic freedoms that underpin the EU. And we need to make sure that they are rigorously applied in all areas of life. And one of the biggest challenges for all of us is common security and common defense, perhaps. External borders that are still porous, and migration that still is present at our external borders. And last but not least, one of the biggest challenges is also partnership with countries in our neighborhood. Thank you.
Monsieur Caputo, 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Mr. Caputo, 1 minute.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President. We're all unhappy about Brexit, but let's be realistic. Being too tough shouldn't lead us to show selfishness over the common good. It's more than just the interests of individual member states or the United Kingdom. They should never win out in the negotiations. And if we're going to do this properly, we should do it in a transparent way and as a single package. We need, of course, to keep close links with the United Kingdom, but let's be careful about the message we send out. The 4 freedoms of the single market are indivisible, and you can't simply pick and choose which ones you respect. A country outside the EU can't enjoy the same rights and advantages as the member states. The negotiations could have a transitional system as well, but prolonging such a thing for too long wouldn't help the interests of the European Union, and without any desire for revenge, needs, of course, to give a clear lead as far as its political activities are concerned. Thank you. Mr. Marias. Once again, we see Mr. Tusk and Mr. Juncker. We hear what they say, and they're talking about the same policies. It's business as usual. Messrs. Tusk and Juncker, I do hope you are listening to the voice of the citizens, particularly young people, strongly criticising the bankocracy and the bureaucracy of Brussels and the European and world establishment. People are calling for a change in the productive model. We want to make sure that the wealth generated in the European Union is just fairly allotted and distributed. We want to make sure that jobs are created for millions of poor people in Europe. Listen to the voice of a Europe of solidarity, Mr. Tusk, of Europe of nations, fatherlands, motherlands, something which serves the interests of its member states and its peoples, not the banks and lenders. Europe that supports the social aspects and uses globalization but rejects CETA and TTIP, which will simply marginalise millions of citizens in Europe. Thank you, President.
Meissner.
Ms. Meissner.
Thank you, President. I think we all regret Brexit is happening, but if Brexit is good, then I think, for one thing, is that people should think about what Europe actually means. It's only it isn't only the UK that was Googling what the EU is about, what the EU means. We've seen many pro-EU movements amongst the people that we as politicians couldn't have triggered. There's the Pulse of Europe in Germany. People are actually peacefully demonstrating in favour of Europe. Mr. Brok has just said that Macron has won elections with Europe. And I'd like to pick up on what Birgit Sippel said. It's true that there shouldn't be any punishment of the UK, and that isn't the case at all. Nevertheless, exit has to be toughly negotiated. As Sippel said, the truth has to be told, because before the referendum, Brits were not told the truth about the potential impacts of a Brexit. And for that reason, I think it's essential that we continue to have peaceful relations with one another in the future.
Thank you, Madam President. The decision of the British people needs to be respected without any fear, and the negotiations should begin soon. The European Union and the United Kingdom need to sort out issues such as social rights, what's been achieved by workers in terms of their rights, and these things should not be undermined. It's important that we guarantee all the rights of European citizens who reside and work or live in the UK or study in the UK. We need to make certain that the Easter Agreement is respected for Northern Ireland as well, and the decision for Brexit needs, of course, to be respected by the European leaders. We need to make sure that they listen to the voice of the citizens who are expressing their discontent with neoliberal policies and what's happening to workers' rights in the member states. That's why we mustn't use Brexit as an excuse to try to bring in more neoliberalism and bring in a proper Europe of peoples. Thank you. Mr. Epitideos. Thank you, Madam President. The negotiations on Brexit will give the EU the chance to protect the rights of the approximately 3 million citizens who reside, study or work in the United Kingdom. These people are afraid that they might be punished. It's important that they are protected. They shouldn't be chased out after the transitional period. They need to know that they'll have a future in the United Kingdom. Same thing goes, of course, for British citizens who live in other parts of the EU. On certain positions that I've heard this morning, the so-called nationalists, they say, who have gained ground in the elections, and I've often seen their support double, that's a strange way of using mathematics to come up with figures such as that. Pythagoras and Euclid wouldn't recognise this kind of thing. Perhaps they should have some sort of mathematical Brexit.
Kelly.
Thank you very much. I welcome the more conciliatory approach I've detected here this morning, and if we continue with that, I think we can have mature and sensible negotiations and a proper conclusion. Also, I would like to thank Mr Barnier for coming to the EPP Bureau meeting in Wicklow last week, and indeed also for taking time out to speak to the Dáil, the Irish Parliament, and indeed visit the North. In relation to the North, if the European Union, if Ireland and if the United Kingdom do not want a hard border, then why should we have a hard border? And I just want to correct one thing. It has been incorrectly stated that Tony Blair said we needed to renegotiate the Good Friday Agreement. What he said was that the Good Friday Agreement came into being on the assumption that both Ireland and the UK would be in the European Union, and we needed to reword it when the UK leaves. And he did emphasise he wasn't talking about changing the substance of the agreement. Thank you very much.
Monsieur López Aguilar.
Mr. López Aguilar.
Señor Tusk, señor Juncker.
Mr. Tusk, Mr. Juncker, there's no point complaining about Brexit. We've got to be able to do our own business at home. Now, it's no point saying that we didn't have an exit or Frexit, because in the UK there's been a huge growth of the right against the EU because of a campaign. Then the pro-Europeans were very weak in their turnout. But there's a simple reason. That's because the EU supported or turned their back to the citizens. But we need to come up with a response to the millions of the EU citizens who are living in the UK and who want their rights to be protected. And then the UK citizens living in the rest of Europe, many in Spain. I'm thinking about the young people, many young Spaniards, for example, working in the UK who would like the EU to protect their rights, because otherwise the threat is just a growing disconnection of young people and citizens, and that will leave the EU without prospects.
Gospođo predsjedavajuća, Brexit je veliki udarac za Europsku uniju jer je pokazao da se naklonost dobrog dijela.
Brexit is a big blow for the European Union because it has shown us that most people can't be persuaded by European funds and by tourism or by the positive narrative of NGOs. The result of the referendum was very sobering, and in the wake thereof there have been very sobering words. I would like to see a rational approach. If Britain is leaving the European Union, it is not leaving the geographic continent of Europe, and therefore we need to have a form of cooperation which will be conducive to a good result. We must not engage in blackmail. We must not engage in point scoring. It will only be to the detriment of our citizens.
Obrigado, Sra. Presidente. Thank you, Madam President. The worst things will happen if people don't prepare for them properly, and we can now see people saying that there's political support for the European Union by the people because of the recent result in France. But in fact the pro-European parties were strongly punished by the electors. They're just trying to perpetuate the same tired old policies. Sooner or later they will meet the fate of their predecessors. As far as the advance of the extreme right is concerned, you shouldn't just measure it in terms of the electoral success of these parties, but also the way that their principles and values are now being assimilated by other parts of the right or even social democracy. Accepting the reduction of rights, changing economic conditions to serve the interests of big capital, etc. The alternative to the extreme right isn't and can't ever be policies which open the door to the extreme right. Thank you. Ms. James.
Today I have sat in the European Union chamber here in Strasbourg listening to the debate on the conclusions of the European Council meeting 29th of April this year. Quite frankly, the level of ignorance displayed in the comments made by MEP colleagues has been astonishing and also frightening. But I'm not surprised. As a member of the European Union Constitution Committee, all I see and hear is the 1% perspective of pro-EU and penalise the United Kingdom. There is never any balanced or non-partisan exploration of the Brexit aspect, the contribution the UK makes financially, defence and security-wise, or why the vote went the way it did. Now, 68% of the United Kingdom now want Brexit concluded, and I have every faith that post-June the 8th, the United Kingdom Prime Minister Theresa May will deliver and put the United Kingdom, its citizens, its economy, rightly so, and in the forefront of this.
Mulțumesc, doamna președintă. Domnule președinte Tusk, ați început prezentarea cu...
Thank you very much. Mr. Tusk started by saying something that I very much liked, namely that the 4 million EU citizens shouldn't suffer, and I think that's the right approach. Secondly, it's true that the agreement between the EU and the UK should not be about punishment. It's very important that the EU single market should not suffer because of the agreement. It's got to be a win-win agreement so that businesses in the EU don't suffer. President Juncker went to my country and showed that we have a pro-European country. We need a trade agreement that helps all participants. Citizens who voted in favour of the Union in the UK also shouldn't be punished, because we're acting as if all UK citizens wanted to exit. That's not true.
Mr. Kofod.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, I think it's very simple. I think the best trade agreement for the UK is actually membership of the EU itself, but they have excluded that option, so we have to find a fair deal now for everybody. I also think it's very important that the EU is reflecting on the future of Europe, and we must deliver better and take people's concerns much more seriously. First, we need to end social dumping in Europe, ensure decent salary and also workers' rights throughout our union. Secondly, we need to end tax dumping. We see multinational corporations, rich people evading taxes in a scale that is damaging our welfare states in Europe. And finally, we also need to transit our economy, our society, to become sustainable, responding to the climate challenge, and also ensuring our environment, and also ensuring that we manage migration and our welfare states in a much better way. If we do that, we'll have a stronger union. And I hope that the UK will be in a close relationship, and we need a fair deal with them. But I think they punish themselves by saying no to become part of Europe. Thank you so much.
Mr. Zanni.
Köszönöm szépen a lehetőséget és a szót, tisztelt elnök asszony. Nem vitatom annak az...
President. I don't question the need for negotiations on the basis that we're not setting out to punish Britain. On the other hand, we have to be realistic. We have to keep things in proportion. Everything comes at a price. Threats come at a price, mistakes come at a price. And down the course of European history, we've seen that you have to pay that price in those events. During the course of the Brexit negotiations, we must ensure that principles prevail. And that means that the citizens' interests have got to be respected first and foremost.
Et pour conclure, Monsieur Donano. Last speaker, Mr. Donano.
Oui, Madame la Présidente, merci.
Thank you, Madam President. The citizens of the UK decided to leave the European Union. Obviously, it varied from part to part. The Scots and the Irish didn't vote in that way. So this could be problematic, which is a great pity. But we also need to look at the role that certain bodies played in this. We need to fight extremism. We need to make sure that UKIP, which has played a pernicious role in all of this, it doesn't really reflect the interests of the UK. And let's hope, Mr. Barnier, as a negotiator, that we need to protect the European institutions. It's also important to protect the rights of citizens, particularly when it comes to freedom of movement. Thanks very much.
Je donne tout de suite la parole à Michel Barnier.
Michel Barnier.
Au nom de la Commission.
On behalf of the European Commission.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour.
Thank you, President. I'd like to thank all of you. First of all, I'd like to thank your Parliament. Not only the President of the Parliament, but also Guy Verhofstadt earlier on, for the trust you have expressed in my task, and for the spirit of cooperation that is very clear between us. And as well as thanking the Parliament, I'd like to personally thank President Tusk, his cabinet and the Secretary General of the Council, because ever since the start, well, it's not by chance that we were able to reach such a rapid agreement the other day. It's because we've been cooperating, working very hard together in a determined way, and I think that's how we're going to ensure unity throughout the whole way. President Juncker, the first to place his trust in me, then recommended to the European Council through the negotiating guidelines that the Council should adopt detailed guidelines also governing the method of the negotiation. On the 22nd of May, the General Affairs Council will be endorsing these guidelines. President Tusk said very clearly how the Council and his authority is going to have a phased approach and a sequenced approach. He said very clearly that, first of all, we need to agree on the principles of the three major issues on which the sovereign decision of the UK to leave the EU today is creating a great deal of uncertainty. We have to remove that uncertainty as soon as possible, first for the citizens, for the beneficiaries of the EU budget, and also for the borders, in particular in Ireland. So the sequencing isn't there to create problems or to hand out punishment to the UK, but the sequencing is there to solve the problems and to treat them in the right order. As the treaty states, it talks about organising an ordered withdrawal, taking into account the future relationship, and an orderly withdrawal is precisely these three major subjects, as well as some others, such as the governance of the agreement or the administrative and judicial matters. However, there is another matter that I'd like to say as the negotiator, that the agreement is there to create a foundation of trust. We have to make sure that's there, first of all, by solving the problems for the citizens, for the beneficiaries of the structural funds and the borders. We have to create the foundations for ongoing trust that we need to build the future relationship with the UK. That is a sine qua non. And I'd like to repeat to you that our aim is to achieve an agreement. I certainly don't intend to have no agreement, no deal or a bad deal. We want to conclude a deal with the UK, not against the UK. And in fact, I'd very much appreciate that on the UK side you could find the same spirit to reach a deal with the EU, not against the EU. So as we start the negotiations, we hope to start those as soon as possible, the day after the elections that May has called for the 8th of June. And clearly, the fact that elections take place just before the start of negotiations will give a clear stability and visibility to our UK partners. That's what we need as well, and I think that's one of the key elements for these negotiations to be a success. I talked about trust that we've all talked about. There's a corollary to that. It means that we, together with the other institutions, are going to be transparent with you. We are going to have be permanently available to ensure your institutions and your parliament as well throughout the process of negotiation. So I will be available to you and the team headed by Verhofstadt, a new president, to have exchanges after or before every negotiating round. And I speak for myself and the whole of my task force that I've been able to set up thanks to the trust placed in the Commission services and also together with President Juncker. We're also prepared to have full or great transparency on all the negotiating documents that will be made public. And I'd now like to reply to some of the issues that have been raised. First of all, on citizens' rights. Mr. Weber, Mrs. Grappino, Mrs. Gardini, and even Mr. Fitto, who's left, talked about a fair and balanced agreement. At the start of the negotiation, we've got an ambitious position set by the European Council, which is perfectly legitimate, calling for European citizens and British citizens alike affected by Brexit to be able to continue to enjoy the same rights. That will apply for the citizens, for their families, and we're talking about all rights: residence, freedom of movement, right of access to social security, right of access to the labour market. We're talking about the rights that will be acquired and maintained up until the day of Brexit, and we will ensure that these rights are guaranteed. Now, this is a very serious subject. It affects people's daily lives and that of many families. We cannot simply have a declaration of intent. On the financial settlement, and I'm pleased that Mr. Farage is here because he quoted me. Now, I've never quoted these figures. The figures will depend on the methodology that we have to agree on. It will also depend on the actual date of the UK's exit. It's not Mr. Barnier who's going to set a figure. As the European Council has said, we're going to work together with the Brits very calmly to find an agreement on commitments undertaken. It's not about punishment. It's not an exit bill. Particularly given the financial perspectives that are underway. We've undertaken financial commitments together with the 28, so we have to shoulder those responsibilities together as 28, and we benefit from them together as 28 across the board, all regions in the EU, for universities, research labs, students and farmers. So obviously we have to settle these accounts as we do in any separation, no more than less. I'm going to do it perfectly calmly. It's not about revenge. It's not about punishment. I'm simply going to look at the figures and the facts and the commitments that have been undertaken, no more, no less. On Ireland, where I had the privilege of visiting last week and visiting both chambers of the Parliament, Mr. Kelly and Mr. Nicholson referred to that visit, which moved me and I thought was very useful. It's a unique situation, therefore we have to find a unique solution. And of course, our solution should not call into question the integrity of the single market. We will do all we can to find a solution which clearly and fully preserves in all its aspects the Good Friday Agreement. Mrs. Anderson and Mr. Brok referred to this, and can I remind you that the UK is a co-guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement. As to the transitional periods raised by Mr. Caputo, well, we might be working on transitional measures post-Brexit, on a phasing out period and then a phasing in towards the new relationship. But the real transition period is now, before exit, between now and the day of exit. So I'd like to recommend all economic players, all economic operators, to make full use of this period so that the day of the exit, probably in March 2019, is as orderly as possible. But I'd also like to say to Mr. Van Dalen, who raised some specific issues such as fishermen. I'm very familiar with that. I was fisheries minister in my country, Mrs. James and Mr. Vimsky. I'd like to say very clearly to them that everyone should understand it's the UK that has decided to leave the EU. It's not the other way around. And there were many of us who have regretted that decision, but now we have to implement it. And that decision has consequences. And anyone who says that it can be business as usual afterwards, well, that's not telling the truth. We're going to have to unravel 44 years of integration in economic relations, financial, technical, legal, human, social relations, and that's the decision of the UK, 44 years. No one should underestimate any of the consequences here, nor the legal complexity of this separation. So I really want to make that clear. We need to tell the truth to the citizens. And I'd like to recommend that we take a very calm democratic pedagogical approach. We should explain exactly what Brexit means. As I said last week, Mr. Nixon in Dublin, what does it mean to be a member of the Union? What does it mean to no longer be a member of the Union? For citizens' daily lives, for consumers and businesses, we've got to tell people the truth. I also recommend that we take time to explain to the people talking about no deal what exactly that would mean. Now, what would it mean to have no agreement whatsoever? And I think we should take time to explain that to people and citizens, not only in the UK. Ladies and gentlemen, as the Council wishes, we are going to have a phased approach to build a new partnership, new relationship with the UK. Ashley Fox raised this very wisely earlier. It's not too early to start to sketch out that relationship. It will include free and fair trade agreement, cooperation agreements, particularly regarding universities and research, and partnership, as we hope, in the area of security and defence. There are two important points as far as these future relations are concerned. We will never accept that a free trade agreement will lead to unfair competition or a lowering of our social standards. Mrs. Zimmer made that point, so did Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Kofod and others. We cannot accept a lowering of social taxation or environmental standards in the EU. At the same time, there can be no horse trading when it comes to security and trade issues. Richard Corbett raised the complexity, particularly as regards the agencies. I don't need to come back to that. And I'll conclude with more political remarks. At a time where we're preparing to start the negotiations that have not yet started, the clock is ticking. There isn't much time ahead of us to conclude a good deal. I'd like to come back to what Mr. Niedermüller, Mr. González Pons and Mr. Lamberts raised earlier. There are consequences to Brexit. And on your behalf, I'm going to have to deal with many of these consequences in the negotiations. There are also lessons to be learnt from Brexit, and that's something else. I think we have to listen to some of the reasons given by the UK citizens, as in other countries, with these protest votes that's accompanied by rage, feeling of being left behind, excluded, not benefiting from any progress. And I think we shouldn't confuse populism with popular sentiment. It's important for us all to hear the popular sentiment being expressed and draw lessons from Brexit. And finally, I'd like to say to Mr. Gualtieri and Mr. Weber, who talked about unity, that the unity we have built together under the aegis of President Tusk, with the confidence of President Juncker and President Tajani, it's important for me as a negotiator. I need that trust, and I will ensure it is maintained and nurtured throughout the whole process. And that unity should then be used by the heads of state and government and institutions to do other things. Brexit isn't the only thing on the radar in Europe. There are many other challenges, such as those mentioned by Mr. Lamassoure on defence and security, border management, the single market, the Eurozone. So, as a negotiator, I think it's very important for everyone to understand that we need this unity that we've been able to put together around the negotiation. That unity will be useful for the remaining European agenda. EU leaders and yourselves should mobilise on a proactive, positive agenda on other challenges, and that will strengthen the unity that I need in the negotiations. So it's an interactive unity that we need, and for that I very much thank you for the confidence you're placing in me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Barnier. I shall now give the floor to the President of the Council.
Thank you, Mr. President, and
thank you for your words of support in today's debate. Until today, I haven't witnessed such unity for the matters that I report here in the European Parliament. Our unity is the most important condition for the positive outcome of the negotiations. Thanks to this unity, we will also be able, together with the leaders, to deal in the coming months, first and foremost, with the positive agenda for the Union of the 27. I agree with my friend Guy Verhofstadt that this should be our priority, not Brexit. Today I will meet President Macron in Paris, and I'm really happy that also thanks to you, to this debate, we will be able to devote our meeting to the future of 27, not to Brexit only. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much indeed, President Tusk. That concludes the debate on the preparation, on the conclusions of the European Council meeting.